You are not born in darkness. That is the first lie told about you. Before the pit, before the fire, before the name became a warning whispered by frightened mouths, you were light. Not borrowed light, not reflected light. The kind of radiance that made lesser beings lower their gaze without understanding why. You stood near the highest throne, close enough to eternity that distance itself seemed beneath you. You were not created ugly. You were created magnificent. And that was the beginning of the fracture. Because beauty does not always lead to gratitude. Sometimes it leads to measurement, to comparison, to the fatal moment when a being made to shine begins asking why he must shine for someone else. That is your life from the inside. Not the simple story of evil rising from nothing. Not the cartoon of a monster born wicked. But the life of the brightest one in heaven, learning too slowly and too completely that brilliance can become hunger, hunger can become pride, and pride can become a fall so vast that the whole universe remembers the sound of it. You were not born to crawl. You were born so high that when you fell, the fall itself became myth. 1. Born in the nearness of glory. From the beginning, your existence is proximity, near the throne, near the music, near the impossible order of heaven. Other beings know devotion because they are built around it. They orbit power gladly. They sing because song is their shape. But in you, something more complicated is placed. Splendor, yes. Grace, yes. Intelligence sharpened with terrifying precision, but also self-awareness. The dangerous ability to not only reflect glory, but to recognize yourself reflecting it. And once recognition enters a being, innocence becomes fragile. At first, heaven still feels whole. The hierarchy makes sense because everything around you shines with coherence. Obedience is not yet humiliation. Service is not yet smallness. You belong to an architecture so complete it seems incapable of contradiction. If there is a highest center, then nearness to it feels like fulfillment. So you sing, you blaze, you move through heaven as one of its great ornaments, one of its brightest proofs that divine order is beautiful. But beauty can become a mirror, and a mirror, used too long, can become a question. You begin to notice what others do not seem troubled by. Why must radiance always bend upward? Why must brilliance remain derivative? Why must nearness never become a quality? There is danger in these questions, but the danger is subtle at first. They do not arrive as rebellion. They arrive as curiosity sharpened by self-regard. The kind of thought that can still pass for philosophy while it is quietly turning into resentment. That is how it starts. Not with fire, with perspective. You do not yet want to destroy heaven. You only want to know why heaven belongs more fully to someone else than to you. 2. The pride that grew in light. Pride never feels like madness while it is growing. That is why it is so difficult to stop. If you had been ugly, perhaps humility would have found easier ground in you. If you had been weak, perhaps obedience would have remained a practical fact. But you are neither. You are magnificent, and magnificence is a dangerous environment for the soul. The more beauty surrounds you, the easier it becomes to mistake admiration for evidence. The more power moves through you, the easier it becomes to interpret dependence as injustice. Others adore the source. You begin to study your distance from it. That shift changes everything. At first, your pride is internal. It does not need witnesses yet. It feeds on comparison, on the silent mathematics of rank and radiance. You measure what you are against what is above you. And because you are glorious, the distance begins to feel offensive rather than natural. Submission, which once seemed elegant, now seems like underuse. Service begins to look suspiciously like diminishment. There is no rebellion without a prior intimacy with order. That is why your story carries such force. You're not an outsider clawing at heaven from below. You are something formed inside its beauty, taught its harmony, fluent in its glory, and therefore uniquely capable of interpreting hierarchy as insult. This is the stage where your mind becomes dangerous. Because the proud do not merely desire more. They revise language itself so that more begins to sound righteous. Independence becomes dignity. Refusal becomes strength. Defiance becomes authenticity. Soon you are no longer saying, "I want what is above me." You are saying, "Why should what is above me remain above me at all?" By then, the argument is no longer emotional. It has become metaphysical. And once pride starts talking in the language of principle, it becomes hard to distinguish rebellion from revelation. That is why the beings around you begin to divide. Some remain steady in devotion. Some are dazzled by your certainty. Some do not fully understand what you are becoming. Only that your voice now carries a gravity that feels less like praise and more like alternative gravity. That is the true beginning of civil war. The moment another center of meaning enters the room. 3. The war above. Heaven does not become a battlefield all at once. Even war there begins as persuasion. You gather not with crude threats, but with vision. Pride always recruits more effectively when it sounds like liberation. You do not present yourself merely as the one who wants power. You become the one asking forbidden questions aloud. Why should glory kneel forever? Why should we exist only to obey? Why should created magnificence never rise into sovereignty? Those are dangerous questions because they are not empty. They contain real tension, even if they lead toward catastrophe. That is what gives your rebellion its force. It is not nonsense. It is misdirected truth. There is dignity in will. There is danger in hierarchy. There is terror in absolute submission. But truth, once separated from proportion, can become a weapon sharp enough to cut reality out from under itself. So the lines form. Loyalty hardens. Pride radicalizes. Heaven, the place imagined by lesser beings as eternal peace, reveals that even proximity to perfection does not erase the possibility of refusal. Perhaps it intensifies it. For what is more volatile than a radiant being deciding he was made for more than worship? The war that follows is not merely a clash of force. It is a clash of meanings. On one side, order, obedience, source, center. On the other, selfhood, refusal, ascent, rival, brilliance. And you are at the front of the second. This is the part later traditions make loud with thunder, swords, falling stars, angels colliding in impossible skies. Maybe that is how it looked. Maybe any imagination large enough to hold the scene must turn it into spectacle. But from the inside, the deeper violence is simpler. You finally commit to the thought that had been growing inside you all along. You would rather fall as yourself than remain forever beneath another. That is the sentence that breaks heaven. Because once it is truly believed, compromise becomes impossible. Pride, this absolute, cannot negotiate. It can only win or be cast down. And when the answer comes, it comes with the terrible clarity pride always underestimates. You lose. Not because your brilliance was unreal. Not because your will was weak. But because magnificence is not the same thing as source. And all the radiance in the world cannot keep a created being from learning that distinction the hard way. 4. Cast out of light. There are defeats that wound, and there are defeats that rename you. This is the second kind. To be cast down is not only to lose height, it is to lose interpretation. Everything that once made you dazzling is retranslated by the fall. Brilliance becomes arrogance. Independence becomes rebellion. Beauty becomes corruption. The songs once associated with your glory now echo as evidence of what pride destroyed. The same radiance that once marked you as near the highest now becomes part of the horror, because fallen light is more frightening than ordinary darkness. You do not descend gently. No myth ever imagines your fall as quiet, because quiet cannot contain the scale of the transformation. Down becomes more than direction. It becomes condition, exile, separation. The terrible discovery that there is no returning by intensity alone, no climbing back through force of personality, no dazzling the gates into opening once judgment has closed them. This is the moment people think they understand you best. They imagine the fall as instant simplification. Heaven loses an angel, hell gains a devil. But that is too neat. Falls like yours do not erase memory. They sharpen it. What makes your exile unbearable is not merely pain. It is recollection. You remember light from the inside. You remember nearness. You remember what obedience once felt like before pride made it intolerable. You remember the music of the place that now rejects you. That memory becomes part of your punishment. A creature born in shadow cannot miss the sun like you can. And so exile does what pride alone could not. It changes your rebellion from philosophy into bitterness. Before the fall, you want to hide. After the fall, you want reversal. Before the fall, you challenged heaven to prove yourself. After the fall, you begin to define yourself against heaven entirely. That difference matters, because resentment is pride after defeat has had time to rot. 5. Lord of the Broken. Once you are below, the story changes shape. You are no longer the shining rebel of the upper realms. You become ruler of the cast out, center of a kingdom made not of order freely loved, but of ruin organized around refusal. Others fall with you or after you. Broken wills gather. Wounded brilliance curdles into hierarchy again, because even rebellion recreates structures once enough beings are trapped inside it. This is one of the deepest ironies of your life. You rose against the throne and then built your own form of dominion in the ruins. Perhaps that was inevitable. Power rejected does not always become freedom. Sometimes it becomes mimicry. The rebel who cannot surrender the appetite to rule often ends by constructing a second kingdom out of negation. Not paradise, not liberation, just an empire of grievance, intense enough to imitate purpose. And yet you are not small there. That is important. Many retellings flatten you into mere punishment, as though after the fall you exist only to suffer and tempt. But from inside, your role is more terrible than that. You become a will that cannot stop willing, a consciousness that cannot stop opposing, a ruler whose kingdom is built from everything cut off from the source and still conscious enough to hate the separation. That makes you powerful again, but differently. Not bright, not free, but influential in the way infection is influential. You learn another kind of rule, not over choirs, but over wounds. Not over praise, but over distortion. Pride, envy, accusation, despair, seduction, doubt. These become your new instruments. If you cannot reign from the height of light, you can still work through fracture. You can still enter the human story sideways. You can still whisper to pride because you know its language better than almost any other being in existence. And perhaps that is the darkest continuity in your life. Even after the fall, your deepest gift remains persuasion. 6. The brightest one to fall. In the end, this is why your story endures. Not because you are merely evil. That would make you simpler, and simple things do not survive in imagination as long as you have. Your story lasts because it carries too many truths at once. The danger of beauty, the corruption of self-regard, the seduction of autonomy severed from wisdom, the way greatness can become grievance when it refuses limits, the way memory can make exile more agonizing than fire. You are unforgettable because you are not just darkness. You are darkness that remembers light. That is a much more frightening thing. A creature born below may hunger for ascent, but you knew what height felt like. You knew the structure of glory from inside. You knew the warmth of nearness before becoming the symbol of separation. That is why your rebellion keeps resonating through every later imagination. Religious, literary, psychological, political. You are never merely a monster in those retellings. You are the archetype of the being who could not endure dependence, who mistook self-exaltation for freedom, and who discovered too late that the price of refusing to kneel was not sovereignty, but endless distance from what once made him radiant. And still, there is tragedy in you beyond condemnation. Because somewhere behind the adversary, behind the tempter, behind the king of the fallen, the memory of the first brilliance never fully disappears. It cannot. Your very horror depends on it. If you had always been low, your fall would mean less. If you had never been beautiful, your corruption would not fascinate so many minds. If you had never stood near glory, your exile would not echo the way it does. That is why the line survives. The brightest one to fall. Not because brightness excused you, Not because the fall was unjust, but because the magnitude of the fall reveals the magnitude of what pride can destroy. That is your life as Lucifer, not the life of a beast born in hell, not the life of a simple villain, but the life of a radiant being who could not bear that radiance was not his own source. You rose near the highest. You mistook splendor for equality. You called rebellion freedom. You lost heaven. You kept memory. And from that memory, you became one of the most enduring symbols ever imagined. Not of darkness alone, but of light turned against the order that gave it meaning.